Well, I think the antitrust law is actually pretty good and quite flexible. I think the problem is with antitrust economics, and it's not necessarily the consumer welfare standard as such. I think the problem is that it's been interpreted as a short-term consumer welfare criteria, and it should be long run. And if you interpret it as being long run, then there's room for the innovation story to come in. The fundamental problem with our antitrust economics, in my view, is that innovation economics has been squeezed out, despite the fact that people will protest and say, no, 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 we of course pay attention to innovation, but then they tend to use standard microeconomics price theory, which pushes it out completely. So the challenge is to change the consumer welfare standard, to put it where it was always intended to be, which is a long-term perspective. And then that brings in the opportunity for bringing innovation in as the driver of competition and focusing on what is the impact of these business practices on innovation, because that's a critical thing to focus on. I think it's a huge mistake. As we know from many other industries, regulation, first of all, tends to drive out innovation. Secondly, it becomes rigid. And the notion that you can regulate a fast changing industry and expect it to perform well is, in my view, not a tenable position. So to assume this is a public utility story all over again is to make a colossal mistake, in my view. I think on what in the United States we think of as Section 1 issues or conspiracy issues, I think a pretty good job has been done. And there's a lot that we can be proud of. On Section 2 on monopoly issues, I think the fundamental problem all along is antitrust economics is not really focused on the foundations of firm level performance and prosperity. And there's a constant confounding of high profits with antitrust bad behavior of one kind or another, or conduct that's not consistent with antitrust. So for me, if our enforcement agents had a better understanding of the difference between what I call Schumpeterian profits or even Ricardian profits and naked monopoly profits, we would be making we'd be doing better enforcement and better public policy. And to me, it's quite remarkable that we have almost a century of Section 2 enforcement activity, where all of these things are basically thrown into the same pot. And I think that's where the fundamental problem is. It's that our understanding of how firms build competitive advantage, and in particular, how technological innovation drives competition, our understanding of that is being held up because we've been infatuated with a few simple models that are really not fit for purpose. So I actually blame the professional classes a fair amount for not getting onto it and taking the world as it is rather than as I would like it to be for modeling purposes. Well, to me, this is a classic case of a phenomena getting overblown, and it's almost this knee-jerk reaction now that every acquisition is just snuffing out future competition. There may have been some instances where that is true, but in general, it's not true. I think that consumers want solutions. Coming back to your first question about consumer welfare, it's not just a matter of price and output. It's a matter of providing integrated, user-friendly solutions. And that often requires the larger platforms to bring in, rifle shot innovations and new products and services that will strengthen their overall offering. So a consumer focus would actually lead you to want to have a lot of these mergers. That said, what we need is a reasonably robust model of potential competition so that we can understand whether or not any of these little acquisitions could actually result in more formidable competition if they were allowed to grow on a standalone basis. But once again, this is where antitrust economics has let us down. There's almost nothing in the way of serious work on potential competition and fleshing out an understanding, which would have to be an evolutionary understanding of how firms are likely to evolve and competition is likely to evolve. So these white spaces, if you will, these gaps in our understanding are now causing us to take knee-jerk policy responses rather than get back to the drawing boards and try and build a better understanding of potential competition. Breakup is an easy thing to say, but a hard thing to effectuate in a way that doesn't have more collateral damage than benefits. So, if there was a rich and robust understanding of big tech, and we had wise policymakers stepping forward with well thought through plans for divestiture, that would be one thing. But we're not in that position. We have I think a dearth of deep understanding in economics and in policy with respect to how these companies have come to be successful. And people like Elizabeth Warren want to kind of assume that this is just the old railroads and oil monopolies of yesterday. It's a very different phenomena. And there are enormous integration benefits associated with using behavioral data that's collected in one area, using it in a different area. So there are economies of scope as well as scale. There's new AI operating models that are being employed. All of this makes for a very different form of competition or a very different way for firms to succeed. So to take out a cleaver and start chopping pieces off without understanding what you're doing, I think would be a travesty. So I have no confidence that the people that are actually proposing divestiture have any idea what they're talking about. Well, they clearly have important roles. I know that seeking more enforcement dollars, in my view, if they just spent the dollars I've got and focused on building and implementing a model of dynamic competition, I think we get better public policy and better enforcement decisions. So they're critical agencies, but it's also important that they every so often go back to the drawing boards and come up with a rich and robust understanding of the issues at hand and how they've changed. So they're very important, but I think they can also be misused if they're driven by political agendas rather than by focusing on improving the economy and ensuring that long-term consumer interests are taken care of. If that's what happens, then their proper role is being usurped. Well, all of your questions have been very good, but that one's particularly good in my view. For analytical convenience, we like to put, competition policy off in one little box and put technology policy off in another little box and industrial policy off in another box, and never should they meet. And that's for the analytical convenience of enforcers, that might make some sense. But we shouldn't be doing policy for the analytical convenience of the agencies. We should be doing them in a way that is coherent, and we're not. China is, we are not, and we're paying the price of that. So in my view, competition policy and competitiveness, which is understanding, how we build a long-term competitive advantage and use that to enliven innovation in the economy, they need to be married. And there's very little work that tries to do that. People confuse the two concepts and the two words, and prefer to keep things separate when in fact they need to be coordinated. So I think there's an opportunity to coordinate them all around what I call an innovation first agenda. If you look at competition through a dynamic lens, you'll get drawn to understanding how critical innovation is. Industrial policy to me is really all about making sure that innovation systems are robust, and that there's sufficient reward for innovation, and I think that needs to spill into trade policy as well. So putting innovation first is a way to begin to integrate these three different areas of policy action in a way that's consistent and likely to be beneficial. Well, yeah, it's relates to my initial statement that antitrust law is fairly robust and flexible. And before we start changing the law, I think we should look at the underlying economic models that we're using and come to understand the phenomena. And I'm quite certain if we do so, that inside the existing legal structures, we can do a much better job. There's also the need for interagency coordination. So there's the need for policy leadership, from the White House and elsewhere to get these different aspects of competitiveness coordinated. So there is something to be done at the administrative level, less to be done at the legislative level, and a lot to be done at the economic policy level.